Today, from the tranquility of this old Castilian town, my soul returns to that lost corner of the Philippines. There, where the jungle devoured the roads and the humidity seeped into the bones. Where we were the last of an empire that was crumbling away. By the end of the 19th century, Spain, our homeland, was already faltering. Cuba was rising in rebellion. Puerto Rico was being lost. And the United States circled like a vulture sensing blood. We were sent to the Philippines as part of an army trying to hold on to what had already been sentenced. Far from the jungles of the Philippines, the final move was being played on the other side of the ocean. In Havana Bay, the USS Maine lay anchored, a gesture of apparent courtesy by the Washington government. In the offices of the White House and Wall Street, they had long been speaking of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The old Spanish dominions were already seen by American eyes as natural pieces of their rising sphere of influence. Spain, worn down by colonial wars, economic hardship, and the turn of the century, could barely hold on to what remained of its empire. On February 15, 1898, at 9:40 p.m., the Maine exploded into 1,000 fragments. The blast lit up the bay like a flash of iron and fire. More than 250 American sailors died. The investigation was never conclusive. The explosion could have been an internal accident, a failure in the ship's own magazines, or most likely a stratagem orchestrated by that Anglo-Saxon world we've since grown used to. A calculated maneuver, but the propaganda machine didn't need proof. Spain has destroyed the Maine, screamed the headlines in the sensationalist newspapers of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Yellow journalism had already stirred the American public for months, preparing the ground for intervention. Now they had the spark. In less than 2 months, the U.S. Congress authorized war. The people cheered. In Washington, they spoke of liberating oppressed peoples. In truth, the strategic maps pointed elsewhere. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Caroline Islands, the Philippines. An empire born from the ruins of the Spanish one. From our trenches, we had no idea what the Americans were plotting. In New York, an editor and a cartoonist were all it took to fabricate the war to come. You put the drawings and I will put the war. William Randolph Hearst. The Filipinos, weary of centuries of rule, began the rebellion. And the Americans, ever skilled at disguising ambition as justice, offered promises of freedom to the insurgents. Empty promises. Aguinaldo, leader of the rebels, believed them. He trusted the words of independence coming from Washington, but it was all a farce. They only wanted the islands for themselves. One master replaced another. We, Spanish soldiers, were pawns on a much larger board. We were sent to Balear, a small, forgotten town on the eastern coast of Luzon. When we arrived in Balear, the jungle covered everything. The heat was thick, like a constant sweat you couldn't escape. There we were ordered to fortify ourselves in the church of San Luis de Tolosa. We were 50 men, 50 anonymous faces that would soon merge with history. On June 30th, 1898, the siege began. Surrounded by hundreds of Filipinos, cut off with no hope of reinforcements. When we barricaded ourselves in the church, we knew we were about to face the hardest battle of our lives, but we didn't yet grasp its full magnitude. The stone walls seemed solid, but the humid tropical heat and the fear seeped deeper than any bullet. The days stretched like a sentence, and the nights were enemies themselves, pierced by gunfire and screams. The first days were a blur of adrenaline and terror. Every patrol outside the walls was a dance with death. Friar Candido Gomez Carreño, a Franciscan, chose to stay with us when the siege began, even though he had the chance to leave. He gave us absolution when we thought all was lost. He anointed us in our fevers, watched over us in death. In the darkest days, his voice was the only one that didn't tremble. He was chaplain, nurse, and at times, negotiator, a spiritual solace for the soldiers. He also documented what happened. He left a record. I remember a time when I went out with 2 men to get water. We moved carefully, knowing that a single misstep could be fatal. The sound of a rifle shot was getting closer, and in an instant, one of my companions was hit. I felt the chill of despair and the crushing weight of responsibility. You'd hear gunshots at dawn, ambushes at dusk, screams from the thick undergrowth. That church became both a prison and a home. I still remember how the damp crept through the cracks, how our sticky clothes clung to our skin, and how hunger gnawed at us more each day. But what struck deepest wasn't the body, it was the soul. I saw men, brothers in arms, collapse not from enemy bullets, but from hopelessness. I remember Martin, the corporal who never lost his smile, surrendering to scurvy and slipping away in a sigh, leaving behind a silence that hurt more than any gunshot. There were days when the silence was so heavy you could hear the pounding of your own heart. Fear itself had become a deafening noise. We clung to the memory of Spain, to who we were outside those walls, because inside we were just a group of men fighting not to vanish. One night, as bullets whistled nearby, I sat by the main door and felt sadness overcome me. I thought of Spain, of my mother, of the land I would never see again. And that was when I understood. We were no longer just fighting to resist. We were fighting to keep alive a dignity that seemed to fade with each dawn. I also remember when Sergeant Arenas, with a firm voice weighed down by exhaustion, gathered us all and said that as long as one man remained, we would resist. That moment gave us unexpected strength, as if honor itself had taken shape in his voice, lifting us from despair. But disease ravaged us. I saw friends lose their sanity, raving with high fevers and cold sweats. Some begged for death as relief. Others clung to faith, whispering prayers as if God had forgotten this forsaken corner of the world. And yet, despite everything, we were still there, trapped in the church with the certainty that we were part of a story few would ever remember. Yet for us, it was life itself. But it wasn't only a battle against the Filipinos, it was a battle against oblivion, against the endless waiting. No one responded to our signals or our pleas. We didn't know the war had already ended. Or that our own country had forgotten us, and still we held on. Lieutenant Gonzalez Carrasco and Sergeant Arenas were lighthouses in that storm, their steady voices reminding us that dignity was stronger than defeat. Camaraderie was the only thing keeping us on our feet. I remember sleepless nights, hearing the crack of bullets, the distant howl of the jungle, and the dull ache of our losses. Every time the door creaked, our hearts sank, thinking the siege would end right then and there. Amid the routines of meager meals, patrols, and dusk conversations, the memory of Spain stayed alive. Each night we sang songs from our homeland, shared stories of our villages, of our families, memories and promises of return. We dreamed of a peace that seemed further away with every sunrise. Days became weeks, and weeks turned into months. The Church of San Luis became a sealed world where time moved slowly, or sometimes not at all. There were moments when I thought of surrendering, of trading honor for life, but something stronger than ourselves kept us standing. We were not just soldiers anymore. We were the memory of an empire fading away. One of the hardest days came when enemy fire damaged part of the roof. Tropical rain poured in like a cold curtain, soaking us all and turning everything to mud. That night, the cold felt like an extra punishment. I thought of my brothers, of the cold lands of Castile, and how fate had taken us so far from home to fight in the heart of the jungle. I remember the face of a young soldier, barely more than a boy, who refused to leave his post even after a bullet grazed his leg. The determination in his eyes, mingled with pain, was a mirror of all we carried inside. Fear, yes, but also a fierce love for something we could no longer hold on to. I had never lived through war, only heard stories from my grandfather, but then I understood the truth. We weren't just fighting the enemy. We were fighting time, disease, and despair. In every look, you could see the weight of waiting, and in every word, the question no one dared to speak aloud. Will we ever go home? Hunger made us distrustful and hostile. It wasn't unusual for a minor argument over a crumb of food to turn into shouting, or worse, into frozen silences filled with resentment. But most of the time, camaraderie prevailed, and we shared even the last drop of water. One night, a shot pierced the darkness and struck our doctor. Watching him fall, our healer, now unable to help others, was like losing a beacon. Without him, death felt closer, crueler. One scene I will never forget happened after a long and exhausting day. One of the men began to sing an old Castilian song. At first he was alone, but soon we all joined in. And for a few minutes, the church was transformed into a corner of life and memory. It was the flame that kept us alive, the echo of a homeland that seemed further and further away, yet still lived on in our hearts. For a moment, that church became a piece of Spain, lost but not defeated. Outside, the Filipinos shouted, "The war is over! Spain has surrendered! You don't have to die here!" But how could we believe them? We thought it was a trick to break our morale. We refused to surrender. For months and months, we resisted the siege, with no news of the war. We didn't know that the Treaty of Paris had already handed the Philippines over to the Americans. The Philippines were no longer ours. We were a forgotten outpost, abandoned in time. Still, we never stopped resisting, because surrendering would be a betrayal to those who had fallen, to those waiting for us back home, and to ourselves. Convinced we were fulfilling a sacred duty, we received news, letters, newspapers, even messages brought by friars. They said the war was over, that Spain had ceded the Philippines to the Americans. But we believed it was just another ruse, another trick by the insurgents to make us give up the post. Lieutenant Martin Cerezo was not easily fooled. He read and reread every document, checked dates and news, searched for inconsistencies. Words were not enough. We needed proof. It wasn't enough to be told. We needed to believe. Until one day there was no doubt left. A letter arrived from the government of Spain. Only then did we understand. Our homeland no longer waited for us there. Spain had departed, and we had simply resisted beyond the end of the war. The war was over. Peace had been signed, thousands of kilometers away. Spain no longer claimed those lands, and we, the forgotten of Baler, were finally allowed to return home. A collective sigh passed through the small congregation of soldiers. Some cried in silence. Others looked at each other, not knowing what to feel. We had endured, yes, but for what? For what all this blood, all this suffering? I, Antonio Velasco, felt both relief and bitterness flood through me. At last we would be spared certain death, but the weight of defeat pressed on the soul like a stone. Lieutenant Martin Cerezo spoke in a solemn voice. "This is not the end, comrades. It's a new beginning, though it may come in shadows." And so we emerged on June 2nd, 1899, not as the defeated, but with our weapons and our heads held high. Two days earlier, General Emilio Aguinaldo had signed a decree recognizing our bravery and honor in Balear, allowing our return to Spain with full military dignity. That day was officially declared a national holiday in the Philippines in 2002. The Day of Hispanic-Filipino Friendship was established. The Filipinos received us with respect because in our resistance they saw more than just enemies. They saw men who fought to their last breath for what they believed was right. I will never forget the names of those who did not return. They resisted to their final breath, like true soldiers of Spain. We, the last of Baler, were merely a shadow in the collapse of an empire that was already doomed. We fought for a flag that was being erased from the maps, for a homeland that perhaps had forgotten us in that lost church in the Philippines. But what came next? That was the bitterest part of all. For the Filipinos, the real tragedy was only just beginning. The United States, which had presented itself as a liberator, soon showed its true face. Where they promised independence to the Filipinos, they brought only chains. Where they spoke of democracy, they imposed domination through blood and fire. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had once fought against us, ended up fighting the Americans in a brutal war. He saw villages burned, people massacred, their souls ripped away. General Jacob Smith gave the order in Samar, kill everyone over 10 years old. As a result, 5,000 Filipinos were killed. That wasn't liberation, it was conquest, it was extermination. I remember reading years later Emilio Aguinaldo's words of remorse, his public denunciation of those who had used him as a pawn in their game of empires.
I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. That we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. And they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was. And that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died.
They said they would bring the light of the gospel, but what they brought was fire. They came to teach prayer to those who had already made the sign of the cross under the Pacific sun 3 centuries earlier. Because they didn't come to save souls, they came to change gods. The very men who proclaimed liberty from Washington were the ones who, with blood and fire, subdued an entire people who had placed their trust in them. And I, who suffered that war in the mud of Baler, now understand that the true enemy was not the men who surrounded us day after day. The enemy was much farther away, in the offices of the powerful in Washington, where the lives of soldiers and nations are mere pieces on a board we never see. Sometimes I think that, in that church, trapped, sick, starving, we were freer than many others. Because there, in the depths of despair, we held on to something they couldn't take from us, our dignity. Something those American politicians never had. Faith in our comrades, loyalty to our oath, respect for the enemy who fought us face to face, not from an office with lies. These memories are not just mine, but those of a people who fought for their land, of an empire in decline, and of a history that must never be forgotten. When I returned to Spain, there were no parades. We were few, ghosts of a vanished empire. But deep in my soul, I know we didn't fight for flags or glory. We fought for the man beside us, for the honor of resistance, for not surrendering despite the abandonment. We were received by the Queen Regent Maria Cristina, honored in the name of the King and of the entire nation, for having never ceased to be soldiers until the very last day. And though we were the last, we were always faithful. In less than half a century, the United States dismantled the Hispanic legacy in the Philippines. Over 500 American teachers arrived with one clear mission: to replace Spanish and Catholic education with English, and something far more dangerous, Anglo-Saxon values. They made Filipinos believe their history began in 1898, as if they had lived in darkness before that. They erased 3 centuries of roots, of language, of faith. While English was imposed in classrooms, many Filipinos continued to write in Spanish, defending with verses in memory the soul that could not be taken from them. Because even though they tried to erase their history, the voice of their poets, the faith of their people, and the language of the heart kept the Hispanic heritage alive. Asleep, but not dead. We Filipinos are Asians who dream in Spanish without knowing it. Francisco Sionil Jose. The Philippines was seen as a colony to exploit for raw materials: gold, precious woods, rice, sugar, tobacco, minerals, and spices. They never saw it as an economy to be developed. The American Public Lands Act left many Filipino peasants without land. They exploited the cheap Filipino labor. The great Spanish companies, Tabacalera and San Miguel, the first brewery in Southeast Asia, survived, but now without Spain, and with it, without their soul. And though the Philippines declared independence in 1946, its governments remained under Washington's influence. Years later, as an old man, Emilio Aguinaldo would say, "Spain was our mother country, and with her, we had culture, religion, and dignity. With the United States came lies, massacre, and contempt." In 1958, when King Alfonso XIII died, Aguinaldo attended the funeral at Manila Cathedral. There, amidst prayers and surprised glances, he declared, "He is still my king, because under Spain we were Spanish citizens." The United States is a country that believes it has the right to decide who is white and who is not. Help helping them gain independence was a damn mistake. They never paid their debt, and all they've done since is spit on everything Hispanic. With Cuba, they tried the same as they did with the Philippines. With Puerto Rico, they're still trying. But that is another story. If you want me to tell it, subscribe. Today in my old Castilian village where there's a saying, help crows and they'll peck your eyes out. As I walk in silence, I'm accompanied by the distant echo of the jungle. The faces of those who never returned, the voices of those who resisted, the last of Baylor. It's the same Christ who looked upon us in Baylor. Curious, isn't it? And here, in this Catholic church of a humble Castilian village, a village that bled for Christendom, for Spain, and for Europe. They still pray for those who never returned from Baylor. Because here, where no one shouts freedom with a mouthful of gunpowder, where no one takes the name of God in vain, here is where the true Christians pray. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 7:21.